All right, well, everybody, hello and welcome to another in the FusionReactor webinar series. This one will be on making the most of FusionReactor logs. And I'm Charlie Arehart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And just to clarify, I'm an independent consultant. I work for myself. My domain name is carehart.org. And I just want to clarify, I don't work for Integral, the company that makes FusionReactor, but I'm a big fan. Love the guys, love the product, love helping people use it. I focus on server troubleshooting as a consultant every day. I help a few people a day with various problems they're having, and often it involves showing them how to use FusionReactor, either because they already have it or because I show them that it can do something uniquely beneficial for the problem that they're trying to solve. All right. So in this talk, after a bit of an overview, we're going to talk about the FusionReactor logs. I'm going to introduce them, explain what they are, some high-level things that you ought to understand about them, give some context for things that I've talked about before, and then talk about getting to them. Now, this is surprising for some because either they only think they can get to them through the interface or they don't realize they can get them through the interface. So we'll show both ways of getting to them. And then we'll talk about getting help for them. There is online help for them, and it's really very nice. Once you find it, you go, oh my gosh, I wish I knew that was here, if you'd never seen it before, because it'll give you all the answers to the questions you have about the logs. And then we'll move on to doing some cool stuff with them. And the first thing, because I'm a big fan of just looking at them. I don't need to pull them into anything. There's a lot of value just looking at them as plain text. Some of them are so small in terms of how long a line is that you can see everything you need to see. You don't need to really pull it into something. But there can be value in doing things like, first, importing them into a spreadsheet. Excel, OpenOffice Calc, Google Sheets, whatever you like. There's real value in doing that. So we'll show you that and show you especially some of the cool things you can do once they're imported. And some of you might be stunned at the things you can do. Others might be spreadsheet experts and you'll go, I could tell you a whole bunch more you could do. So anyway, this isn't a talk on all the things you could do. It'll just be some of the key things you can do. Maybe someday I'll do another one because there really are a lot of amazing things you can do with these. Because most people tend to think of spreadsheets as ways to do numerical analysis and sums and financial stuff, but the data we get in logs, whether it's FusionReactor logs or web server logs or perhaps even application server logs, there can be some impressive things you can do with them. Anyway, then I'll move on to mentioning another tool that used to be my favorite. It's not anymore, but I want people to know about it because for some people it may really sing to their heart, called the Microsoft LogParser tool. LogParser, and it's free, and I'll explain to you briefly what it is and point you especially to resources to learn more about it, and it might really appeal to you because perhaps you're in an environment where you want to do this analysis and you can't put a spreadsheet on your server, and maybe you can't easily pull files down, but we'll talk about getting to the files without being on the server. So again, it's not as important these days. It'll become clear as I go on why just doing it in a spreadsheet may be easiest. But then I'll also mention that there are other tools that are built for viewing logs and CSV files, comma separated. These are space separated, but most tools that can do comma separated files can do space separated files. And we'll talk about that separator and how to use it and how to use these tools. I'll show you examples of using these graphical tools that really can be much nicer for some of the things you want to do in looking at the logs. Just eyeballing them as they are can get a little tedious, and having a tool that lines them up, whether a spreadsheet or one of these other simpler log viewing tools, can be really compelling. So that's really, I want to show you a bit about what they are, although I've talked about that a lot in other webinars. I want to especially show you how to find them, how to get to them, how to find help, and then how to use them in various tools. And then I'll wrap up by talking about FusionAnalytics, which is a sister product to FusionReactor, and it specifically focuses on this job of pulling the logs in and doing incredible analysis and saving you the trouble of doing a lot of the stuff that these other tools are about. So I want you to know that that's there and have you take a look at it. It's a very powerful tool, and it could be, again, just the answer that some people want. In fact, I've talked to some people who were building in their own environment something to pull the FusionReactor logs into a database and aggregate it and provide a UI, and that's what FusionAnalytics does. So trust me, it'll be a lot cheaper to just license FusionAnalytics than for you to build even the beginning of such a tool, and it took them years to build it. So anyway, all that is to say is we're going to talk about the many ways that you can do analysis, and you can see the majority of what I'm going to talk about isn't about that. So this is not a Fusion Analytics webinar. In fact, I'll say when we get there that really is deserving of its own webinar. And then we'll wrap up as we usually do with time for questions and answers. So just quickly, I want to say that we do presume in this webinar that you're already using FusionReactor. If you're not, some of this may not make sense. And still, some people who don't use it could get value out of it. Maybe you've been pointed to FusionReactor for the first time, and maybe this is your first webinar. I'm not saying you're going to be lost, but you'll certainly appreciate everything I say insofar as appreciating what the value of the tools are and the value of the logs. But the logs are just a small fraction of what FusionReactor is about. I will say that I think they're a more important part of FusionReactor than most people realize. If you're the sort that just tended to look only at the FusionReactor interface, I want to help you learn how especially to use FusionReactor's logs and to use them to the fullest extent possible to solve your problems. Although again, in other webinars we've talked about using them to solve problems. In this one we're just focused on showing how to use the logs, and I'll point out some things that you go, oh, I see how that could help me solve a problem, but we're not really focused here on solving problems. And then again, you might already be aware of the logs, but you may not yet be appreciating the many tools that are available to work with them. And for some of you, you may take what I've said in the first couple slides and you're already on your own trying those things out. So have fun. But I hope you'll stick around and you'll learn some tips along the way as we go. And I want to remind you, as always, that what I'm talking about here applies to any Java or CFML server that FusionReactor can monitor. So I'll happen to be showing something that's coming from Cold Fusion, but actually I don't think there's anything today. I'll focus on maybe one log that'll be unique to Cold Fusion, but everything else will be generic to any application server you might run. And I just want to clarify, if you didn't know, that FusionReactor can work with, of course, Cold Fusion, but also Lucy and Rilo and Blue Dragon's Java editions, and then of course with any Java server, so JBoss, Tomcat, Wildfly, Jetty, Glassfish, whatever Java application server, servlet engine you may use, you can use it with FusionReactor. And the logs that we're talking about are generated by FusionReactor from any of those environments, and they're amazing logs if you've never seen them. So that's again what we're going to talk about in a moment. And this presentation is being recorded, as they all are, so you'll be able to revisit the details if I go by something quickly, especially once I start showing some user interface elements. If you miss what I did, just come back and watch the recording. Everybody will get emailed with the link to the recording, and then we post them online later at the webinars page. And if you ever forget it, just Google FusionReactor webinars and it comes up as the first result. Alrighty, let's get going. So first about the FusionReactor logs, and again, I've covered them in other webinars in the context of showing how to use a particular log to solve a particular problem, but I just want to say here briefly before we get started, for those that are not familiar with it, that FusionReactor tracks many things automatically all the time. So for instance, an obvious thing is it tracks every request that comes into your application server. And I'll sometimes say Cold Fusion, and just everybody here, when I say Cold Fusion, I mean whatever server you use. So it tracks every request that comes in. It tracks when it starts, it tracks when it ends, it tracks everything about the request, not everything, but a lot of things about the request. You get the URL, you get the IP address, you get the status code, you get the request method, you just get all kinds of stuff. You get things like how many rows were returned from queries, how many queries were done. So it's amazing. We'll see that later. That's just an example. That's the request log. And some people might go, okay, I can get that from a web server log. Well, no, wait a minute. You don't get all that stuff from a web server log. You get some of it. More importantly, what you get from the FusionReactor log is only the requests that got into your application server, whereas the web server logs track everything that comes to the web server, GIFs, JPEG, CSS, JS, and you have to weed through that to find your request that came to your application server. With FusionReactor's logs, especially the request log I'm talking about, it's just everything that got into your application server and only what got into your application server. Anyway, that's just the request logs. And again, this is not a talk to get into all the logs. I've done that in other webinars, but I'll just say that there's, for instance, also a resource log, which I'm a real big fan of, and it tracks the same stuff that's on the metrics web metrics page. If I go to my metrics web metrics page, for those who've used FusionReactor, you're used to this top left corner metrics, then choose web metrics. This is the page that comes up. And this is a high level, how's my application server doing? And in the left is about your requests, then in the middle is about your queries, and on the right and the top is about your heap, and the bottom is about CPU. Well, everything that's in these graphs, everything that's in these graphs is logged. So the graphs are nice to look at what's going on now, and you can look at the last hour right here on the screen. You can drill into these and look back as far as a week if the application server's been up. Again, we talked about that in other presentations. This is not the talk to talk about FusionReactor's interface, but I just want to say that all this is displayed here, but maybe you'll restart Cold Fusion or your application server, and then you'll find that these are gone. And we've talked about that in other webinars, that when you restart your application server, Cold Fusion for instance, everything in here gets gone. And that's a bummer, but it's because FusionReactor runs inside the JVM with your application server. That's a good thing because it gets levels of detail that no other tool that isn't in there can get. But the bad thing is that, yeah, when the application server restarts, these are all gone. And that's disappointing to people because they want to look at, hey, what was request activity before the crash? Well, that's not going to be in these graphs, but it's going to be in the logs. Okay, so there's a log that has all this information, and it tracks the number of requests running, the requests per second, their average duration, the average duration of finished and running, and all these points. Every point on these graphs is logged in the resource log. And then there's many more. We've talked in other webinars about how FusionReactor tracks garbage collection. There's a log that tracks garbage collection. Every 5 seconds, this log and the GC log and memory logs tracking the different parts of memory, they're all every 5 seconds by default. And you might go, ooh, that sounds like that's got to be expensive. Well, no, it's all done very high performance. FusionReactor generally is minimal impact, maybe 1% over the life of your application, so it's insignificant. And then you might say, well, but gosh, that sounds like that's going to be a lot of logs. Nope, it's really not. I find on average it's a few hundred meg over the course of a month for most people, if you just let things be their defaults. Now, some people will be bigger and some will be smaller, but my point is it's not gigs. It's not terabytes. It's typically hundreds of megs. And it's automatically managed, and FusionReactor tracks them for 30 days. The logs are tracked for 30 days, and then they're automatically expired after 30 days. And all that's configurable, and we'll talk in a bit about that. So that's what they track. And the why they're useful, again, is because after a crash, you don't have anything in the interface, but my point is you can go to the logs. And we've talked in other webinars specifically. There was a post-crash troubleshooting webinar a couple months ago, and that was about especially using the logs to solve certain kinds of problems after a crash. And we'll do other webinars in the future that will focus on specific things like memory troubleshooting, and we'll show both the interface and the logs and their value for that. So I've mentioned that the request logs, they're just updated every time a request runs. Every time a request starts and every time it ends, there's a log entry. And then other than that, almost every other log in FusionReactor is just updated every 5 seconds. So every 5 seconds, how many GCs have happened? How long did they take? Every 5 seconds, how much memory is in the old gen? How much memory is in the meta space? How much memory is in the survivor space, code compress, code cache, whatever things your JVM uses. Different JVMs produce sometimes different logs, but the point is all that stuff is available in the interface under the resources menu, and I'll just say that in passing that if you haven't seen the other webinars, yes, in the FusionReactor interface under resources, it's memory spaces, and you can see all the memory spaces. There's a drop down in the top right corner to look at them. But again, I don't want in this talk to get into the interface because we want to talk about the logs. So my point here is just that the logs are updated every 5 seconds typically, and then the ones that are driven like by request, they're just every time a request happens, as soon as they happen. And again, they're kept for 30 days. So these are just points I wanted to make sure I covered, and I said most of them already. 30 days by default. And there is configurability about them, and let me just show you a couple things. Let me go back to my FusionReactor interface. So first, down in the bottom left corner, under logging settings, logging, so on the left, logging settings, this is where, well, first there's a type of log rotation, and the default, since about FusionReactor 4 and above, is to use centralized archival and rotation. It used to be that it was a size and it would rotate them once they reach a certain size, but with the centralized archive and rotation, which is the default now, instead it rotates them every 60 minutes. So at the top of every hour by default, it'll take the logs for that previous hour and zip them up and put them in an archive folder. That's what it does. And the archive and log folders are here on this log directory, and they're by default, and we'll talk about this later in a moment, but it's in here if you ever forget it. FusionReactor instance, your instance name, and then log is where the current hour goes, and then there's an archive folder. And the archive folder is just called archive, and the default behavior, again, is just pure defaults, is keep it for 31 days. After 31 days, automatically get rid of old logs. Okay? And there's even a log archive monitor where you can enable it to schedule a job to look for how full the log is, and if so, send you an email or make a notification. I believe it's just a notification up here, like this is a notification. Okay. So that's one thing I wanted you to be aware of. Now, just a couple other ones that I typically show people is, for instance, in the request log, if you come down to request settings, under request logging, you can enable logging of the user agent. Now, again, I don't have time in this talk to get into what that's about and why that's useful. I did in previous webinars, but the point is if you know what a user agent is, by default, FusionReactor does not track it. But if you enable it, then at the end of every line of a request, it tells you what was the user agent, so what was the kind of browser. Maybe it'll be a spider or a bot or an application server calling in, or Java or Python or curl. You never know until you look at these user agents to know where a request is coming from. Now, of course, they can all lie, but the point is, the majority of requests don't seem to be lying, and when you study them, you find out that they are what they say they are if you really dug into it. And so this is surprisingly valuable to track the user agent, and I like to turn that on by default. And then another log configuration that I like to show people is under JDBC down here at the bottom. If I scroll down, it's not at the bottom. Sorry, I didn't mean to click that button, but if I scroll into the middle bottom in my resolution, pretty low resolution, under JDBC settings, by default, queries are not logged. They're not logged by default. You can enable it, but I'll tell you, a lot of you may find out if you look closely, you might be doing 100 queries per second, 500 queries per second. And if you were logging 500 SQL statements every second, that would become potentially an impact. More importantly, it would make for very large logs. So by default, logging is turned off for the queries. But not only could you turn it on, but more importantly, you can say only log queries that are slower than a given number of milliseconds. So you could say I'll log ones that are slower than 2 seconds. And whatever for you is a pain point, you could say I want to enable logging for those up to that duration or beyond that duration. And just to remind you, if you didn't know, all these interface icons, every interface features has a help. So when you click on it, it explains it with a little more detail. One last thing I'll say before I move on is down here at the bottom, you can indicate how many characters of a SQL statement gets logged. And I believe the default, the default is 1,000, and you could change that, if you wanted to. But be aware, again, if you change it to 2,000, that's going to make the logs a little bit bigger. And also notice it says this applies to logs and display. So for those who know that you can go into FusionReactor and while requests run or are finished, you can look at the SQL that ran. Again, we're not going to get into that stuff now, but yes, you can see the SQL that ran for every request that's in the history or that's currently running. Well, this limits it also to 1,000, so this applies to both the log and the display. Okay, those are the key things that I wanted you to be aware of as common options that you might use to configure the logs. So now let's talk about, remember this talk was more for people who are already using FusionReactor, I assume already had seen the logs and were somewhat familiar with them at least. Now let's talk about getting to them. So first, let's talk about looking at the current hours logs. Now there's a couple things here that might surprise some people. So first, in the interface, up in the top left corner, the FusionReactor menu. Many people don't even notice that's there. There's a lot of cool stuff under this menu. And one of the things under the FusionReactor menu is logs. Now let me be clear. I said we're going to look at the current hours log. So this is not going to let you see logs from an hour ago, a day ago, a week ago. No. This is for the current hours logs, and it's even more limited than that. I'll get to it in a moment. But I'm going to click on logs, and it opens up an interface where if you're not paying attention, you think, well, that's it. I don't care about this Reactor log. In fact, that's not the log I was thinking of. Well, up here in the top right corner, you can say, I want to see, for instance, the resource log. Now, some of you have never seen the resource log, but the resource log, I said, tracks everything that was in those graphs. So just real quickly, if we look at, you see date and time, and then there's always a big number, a little number, and a big number, and we don't care about them for the most part. Then there's mem. In the case of the resource log, mem is followed by the percentage of heap used, 38%. So at the top of my hour, I'm on Central Time. The interface shows me my time, 9 a.m. my time. So at 9 a.m. my time, my heap was 38%. And then over to the right, my CPU, wow, was 39%. But I'm not going to get too worried because just 10 seconds later was only 2%. How do I know it's 10 seconds later? Because this says 03, 08, 13. Remember, they're every 5 seconds. So the point is we can use this interface to look at the logs quickly and easily. This is the current hours logs. I really don't want to get into what the resource log is and how to use it, but I'm just trying to give you a quick guide to understanding what we're looking at. We're seeing one line of the log wrapped, in this case, on the screen, and there's one every 5 seconds in this log by default. Now I can scroll down, and at the bottom I should find the current time as of when I opened that screen, about 9:20-ish. Yep, so 9:20 and 28 seconds was the last line. And of course I could refresh it and it would update. But let me show you also, you can tail it. So look, I'm just going to click tail, and now we're focused on the bottom by default, and if you watch the time right there, see it's changing. So in a moment it's going to be 9:22:03. because it's every 5 seconds, and it's automatically refreshing. And it, it looks like that was off by a few seconds, and when it's off not exactly every 5 seconds, usually if you look at the CPU, something went high, and in fact on my case, something not CF, this total system CPU became 63%. So something else on the box was running, and it affected even CF and FusionReactor's ability to do something as simple as write this line. Again, I don't want to get into that. We talked about some of that in previous webinars. But the point is, yeah, you can look at the logs. Now, in this case, I was looking at everything in my log. It's currently 9:24 my time. I'm seeing everything from 9 to 9:24. But let me show you the request log. We haven't seen that yet. Here, request log. And when we get to it, what's at the top? Well, it's not 9 a.m. It's 9:12 a.m. It's 9:24 now. Well, that's because this does, listen, you got to understand this. This log interface does not pull in the entire log because some logs are very big. In fact, some of you, if you looked at your request log and it was 9:24 when you opened it, you'd see 9:21 here because you've done 1,000 requests in the minute between when you opened it. And the question then is, so what is this showing? Well, by default, it's showing 128K worth of the log. So remember, this is a web interface showing you the logs, and the FusionReactor engineers are trying to be smart and not cripple your browser by pulling in a 10 megabyte log file. It could potentially be that big for some people, or 10K could even be big for some people, based on your bandwidth and based on your available memory and CPU on your machine. Remember, this is my browser. My browser is looking at this log, so they don't pull in the entire log. They pull in the most recent 128K. Now, you might say, well, how did you know that? And what if I want more? Beware, you could make it more, but be careful. It's going to make those pages take longer to come up. But again, down here under, sorry, it was under each one. So like under request settings, we kind of passed by it. We didn't pay attention to it. But here in this logging page, this view size, 128K. And again, if you click the line, you see the number of K of the log file, which will be shown when you select the log option from the table of contents. The wording's not really clear that this was a table of contents up here, but anyway, the point is that's how you control it. So yes, you could make that bigger, but let me tell you, before you slap another 0 on there, that will now be a meg. You're telling it to pull a meg of log data into the interface, and that might be more slower to come up than you may prefer. So it's a balancing act. But again, the point is, we were talking about how to look at the current hours logs files. Now, I want to be clear also about something. I'm going to go, look, I'm not going to click any buttons because FusionReactor is just an HTML interface. I'm going to hit the back button. It used to be Flash back in 3 and earlier, but now, or maybe it was 4 now, I can't remember. But it's now just HTML. So as I hit the back button, I get right back to that place where I was looking at the logs. The next thing I want to say is, let's say I'll refresh it. I know it's going to say probably 9:15 or something like that, or 9:14. If this, listen, if this were 10:01, my clock is now 9:25. If it was 10:01, I just passed the top of the hour, and I came into this interface and looked at this, would I see 128K worth of log data? Probably not, because remember, the archival mechanism takes the current hour's logs at the top of the hour and zips them up. It zips them up, it takes them and puts them in another location. And so you will not be able to see information across an hour boundary when you look at this interface here. Because this web interface, it's looking at the current hour's log, and once that gets pulled out because it got archived, you can't see the previous hour's logs. Not a big deal. I just want to make sure you don't come in here at, say, 10:01, 1 minute after the hour, and think you could see 5 minutes ago. No, you could only see up to the previous top of the hour. Also, only up to the previous restart, right? So if you had just restarted your CFML or Java engine a minute ago and came into these logs interface, you would not see the information from the prior time of the before the restart. Now, I didn't mention that. I think it was on the logging settings, and I've talked about this many times in previous webinars. When your application server restarts, all the logs from that are in the current, we'll say current hour, the current hour's logs, they all get zipped up at that time of the restart. Now, we'll talk about how to see those. Don't get me wrong, you can see them, you just can't see them in this interface. This interface only looks at the current hour's logs and only up to 128K of them. Okay, so that's that. So one way is through the interface, and then the other way is through the file system. I did them backwards, but now the file system. So the file system, the way to get to it, remember it was in that logging settings page. It's I don't have in front of me. Yeah, let me call up my local computer. I do have a FusionReactor running locally. There you go. And I'm going to find my FusionReactor directory. And I'm going to go to instance. So listen, you guys all should have a FusionReactor directory. You might choose to install it in something like apps FusionReactor, but the default is it's in the root, and it's on my C drive. You could have put it on your D drive, whatever. Whoever installed it chose where to put FusionReactor. Well, in the FusionReactor directory, you pretty much don't have to pay attention to any folders in here except instance. So just try to forget everything except instance. And then inside of instance, you'll have usually just Fram and your instance. I happen to have multiple different instances of things, so I've got different folders, but you'll typically have Fram and whatever your instance is. So I'll just go to what my most current one is. So here's my particular instance within the instance folder. And then check this out. Again, there's a bunch of folders. All you really need to focus on typically is log and archive. We'll talk about archive in a moment. But the log folder, now my current instance is not running. Remember, this is my local machine. I should have had a remote desktop. I didn't think about this. But if this were my current running machine, this would be the current date in terms of year, month, and day, and it would be the current hour. So if you guys look at yours right now on a server that's currently running, you'll see today's date, year, month, day, and the current hour. And the point is, when you open up that folder, in there will be logs. Now in the current hour logs, this is what the log folder is, the current hour logs, you'll also see a lock file for every log. And that's just a part of the underlying architecture. Don't worry about it, you can just ignore it. Just don't look at the locks, just look at the log. But the point is, they're all the same log. So if I look at my resource log, and in my case, it's going to open up in a tool that I like called a universal viewer. You might have them open in Notepad or EditPad or Notepad+, or whatever you like to use. And I'm using Windows, but of course all this applies to Mac and Linux, and you could do things from the command line exactly the same way. But the point is, there's my resource log opened in my preferred tool for looking at especially large logs, universal viewer, if you want to look that up. It's great for looking at large logs. You can open up a gigabyte or 10 gigabyte log, and it'll open up in a second because it's smart enough to just pull in what it needs to display the first, in my case here, 20 lines. So anyway, check that out on your own. But the point is I've now opened my current hours logs. So the current hours logs are in your instance name, log folder. The previous hours are not in there. The previous hours are in the archive, and I'll change the screen and the slide in a moment, but we'll just go ahead and move on since we're here. The previous hours and days and weeks logs are in the archive folder. So same instance folder, instead of log, go to archive. You just got to remember that these are the only two folders you need to care about. And now here's the cool thing is, and again, I'm not looking at my current server, so I should have this full of 30 days, but this is my local machine, and I've only started this particular instance these many times. So don't worry about that. You'll have, if you look at your own server, you'll see today's date and every other date, and you can sort it by date modified or by name, and it'll be in that order. But the bigger point is you pick a day, and I really am thinking, well, I'm going to show you how you'll probably do it more typically yourself. Because maybe, listen, you may be thinking, I'm not able to get to the machine. So let me back up. I showed you how to look at the interface to look at the current hours logs. In a moment, I'll show you how to look at the interface to look at the archives. But if you have access to the file system of your server or wherever FusionReactor is running, if you've got access to the files, then I'm saying you can come into this instance name, archive, find the current day, open it up, and then for however long that server's been up, there'll be a zip for every hour. And what you want to do is sort it by date modified. You don't want to try to make any sense of the name. The name is meaningless. And in this archive folder, there's a zip for every hour. So my server happened to be up that day at 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and on down the line. Now, let me repeat, if I'd had a restart of my instance, there'd be a new zip here because it archives them on the hour or when your instance starts. So as soon as it starts, it would create a zip at that time. So if I had a restart, let's say at 5:20, I'd have a zip in here that would say 5:20, and that would include the information from 5 to 5:20. And this 5 includes the information from 4 to 5. Remember, these are created at the top of the hour. The zip is created at the top of the hour. So the time reflects the end of what's in the log. So this, if you're looking for something at 5:30, you don't open the 5 o'clock log, you open the 6 o'clock log. But anyway, so let's say I was interested in something at 4:30. I could open this zip, and in Windows, you don't need any kind of a tool. You don't need Winzip or WinRAR or 7-zip or anything. Windows Explorer, the File Explorer, knows how to open zip files by default. So you can just double click on it, and boom, you're into it. And there's always this FR log rotator plugin. Just ignore it. I've wished that they could make it be that it wasn't there, but it's always there, so just ignore it. And then boom, there's our logs, the very logs that we were able to see in the log interface and in the current hours logs. Here they are in the archive log, and these are the ones from that previous hour. And if I go to my resource log, for instance, this should start at 4 p.m. There it is, 1600. So it goes from 1600 down to the bottom, 1659. Okay, so that's how through the file system you get to the previous hour's logs. Now, how about in the user interface? This is the part that surprises people because some people knew about getting to the file system for the logs and the archives, but some people didn't know that they look at the current hours logs, and a lot of people don't know that they can look at the archives. And in fact, that's because what I'm about to show you is only enabled by default in FusionReactor 6. So if you're still on FusionReactor 5, you don't see this. And it might even be a particular point release like 601 certain update. I don't remember for sure, but if you've downloaded the latest version, which is 628, you can definitely do this. And if you are still on a very old release, if you're on 6 and above, you ought to be going and getting the free update because the point releases within a major release are always free. And we've talked about that in other webinars. Again, I don't want to get in the weeds here. But the point is, in the user interface, all right, so we're now no longer talking about the FusionReactor logs. We're not talking about that. We're talking about down here on the bottom left, when I looked at logging, I saw settings. Well, right above that is log archive. Now, everybody will have log archive, but if you're on an older version, you'll just see this information, but you won't see this being a link that you can click on. And before we click on it, let me just talk about what this is here. So this is today's archives on my server. All right, so now we're not talking about my local copy of FusionReactor anymore. This is my web application, my Arehart.org site. This is my FusionReactor running. It's today, and we're seeing the hour that was zipped up 37 minutes ago. So there's my 9 a.m. zip, and it's presented in sorted order by when they are archived, so I don't have to sort it. It's already presented in sorted order. And again, if there were a crash or restart, I'll just say if the instance starts up again, for whatever reason, if the instance starts up again, the first thing it does in starting up is zip up whatever logs are in the current hour logs. And there would be another zip in here and another time, and you'd see that difference. Again, if I had a crash at 520, there'd be a zip in here at 520. And let me just tell you that it would say over here in the archive comment, it would tend to say post-crash rotation. Now that's a presumption. It doesn't necessarily mean it was a crash. You might have brought it down, applied some update of the JVM or something like that, and then brought it up. That's not a crash, but they're trying to help point out that this is a non-standard archive. It's not the archive scheduler that did it. It was your restart of the instance that created that particular archive, if that happens. Okay. Now again, everybody will see this. Everybody will see this interface, and there's a way to page back through previous days. So I'm going back in time. Of course, there's a calendar, and I can go back as far as the logs go. And it's funny. I think if I look at mine, yeah, I will get to the 17th, because either I changed my setting or I've got some issue. I think I've noticed this before. I've never seen it on anybody else's machine, but I've had beta builds of FusionReactor and stuff like that. So something quirky is making it so that my logs last longer than 31 days. Let me think. Well, actually, right. May 17th is within 31 days. So let's see. Yeah, but I'm trying April 12th. Okay, they're not there. Okay, good. So that's all right. I had in time past found that I was seeing logs beyond 31 days, but you shouldn't. By default, they should be gone after 31 days. But the point is you can pick whatever date you want, and I'll just go right back to today. And here's the cool new thing in FusionReactor 6 and above, is that you can click on a link. So what's powerful about this is that you might not have direct access to the file system. You maybe either cannot row mode in, or you don't have a UNC path or a drive mapping, or just permissions wise, you're not allowed to get on the server, not allowed to see the server. And you might be thinking, oh man, this stuff about the logs is cool. I wish I could see it. You can, because as long as you can get into FusionReactor's interface, FusionReactor, can get to the logs, because it created logs. It can create them, it can delete them, just like your father used to tell you. So anyway, you can see these zips, and yeah, you just click on one, and what's really neat is that, remember, I'm on my local environment, on my local machine. I'm not on my server, so I'm looking at my server through a web interface, and when I click on this link, up pops a link that says, hey, what do you want to do with it? You can save it, or you can just open it. Remember, it's a zip, and I'm on Windows, so by default, I can open it with Windows Explorer, and boom, in a moment, we'll see it open up. There you go. So it's opened it up in Winzip, and there again it's pulled into my local temp folder, but there's my available logs, and I can look at them. Again, I'm looking at them locally, even though they were on the server. This is a copy that's been brought down to me. Sometimes it's a little bit confusing for some people, so we have to be clear. Don't hold that against anybody. Then some people grok this stuff quickly, others are like, wait, what did you do? How'd that happen? So I hope I'm making it clear what's going on here. Now, let me just say in passing, some of you are going to say, well, Charlie, wait a second. If I'm off the server, how can I get to FusionReactor? Because that 8088 port that it uses isn't open to me off the server. Well, if you look up here at my URL, I don't have an 8088 port. Now, I've talked about this in previous webinars. I think it was maybe in the first one or second one on hidden gems. And in some others, I've repeated the point. By default, when you install FusionReactor and you implement FusionReactor into an instance, one of the questions on that instance wizard that you go through says, do you want to enable FusionReactor through the external web server? And it enables it by default, and some people notice that and turn it off. So you may find this does not work, but you might find this works. Notice I'm not using the port, and I'm saying FusionReactor, in my case, because it's a cold fusion server, I'm saying FusionReactor, not slash, but FusionReactor.cfm. And then it adds findex.htm. So just to be clear, if this were me on my server, it might be like localhost colon 8088 slash FusionReactor slash findex.htm. But to get to it from off the server, I say the domain name, whatever domain name is on the website that's handled by the website, if it's going to pass, in my case, CFM pages to, in my case, Cold Fusion, I can just change it to say .cfm instead of slash. Instead of FusionReactor slash, I say FusionReactor.cfm. So yeah, go try that. I'm sure some of you are like, what, really? I gotta see this. So go try it, and it should work. And if it doesn't work, remember you gotta take off the port. And in case you're doing it and not listening to me, hopefully when you watch the recording later and say, how do you do that? You take off the port, and you, in front of the slash, you put .cfm. Or if you're in a Java environment like Tomcat, WebLogic, WebSphere, whatever, you can say .jsp. Okay, so that will do it. And then the rest of it you leave on. You know, it's there if you grab it from a working server and paste it. I'm saying just take out the port, put in the .cfm or whatever is in your environment. And I've talked in the other webinars, and the docs talk about this too, how you can even change that if you wanted to something else. Now let me say too, in case anybody's wondering, you do have to know the password, right? So this is not open to anybody to use. You still have to know the FusionReactor password. But listen, somebody might hear this and go, well, hold on. I do not want my FusionReactor open through my external web server. I can't believe that it did that. Well, it was there during your installation of the wizard. It said it very clearly, and you said okay. So if you want to change it, let me just tell you really quick, you don't have to go freaking out and uninstalling FusionReactor. Just come up here to the FusionReactor menu, enable disable, and we're not disabling FusionReactor, but we could disable access to it on the external web server. And conversely, you could enable it. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, how do I know I have the authority to do that? Well, you're the FusionReactor administrator. If you're an administrator user and you can see this menu, the point is you have the authority to do anything in FusionReactor you want. If you've logged in as administrator, yes, you can turn this on, turn this off. All right. And in other webinars, we've talked about how there's limited function users like an observer and a manager who couldn't change things like this. So if you want to give out access, but you don't want them to have full control of the FusionReactor interface, that's a separate subject, but you can. I'll just tell you real quick, if you think that's really interesting, how do I do that? You go to FusionReactor, change password, and you can pick to enable, for instance, an observer user. And then you give it a password, and now that user is enabled. By default, you're an administrator user, and the password is picked when you install FusionReactor into the instance. But again, we're going off track here. I want to move on to the other stuff that we would plan to cover today. Okay, so that's seeing the logs in the file system. And then online help, very important to know that you can get the online help. So in the FusionReactor interface, in the top left corner, if you click on FusionReactor, and you can see how important this is. We've now been to 1, 2, 3 things. You can go to FusionReactor Help, FusionReactor Help. And when I click on that link, it opens another tab in my browser. Takes me automatically to the FusionReactor website, to the docs of the FusionReactor website for the version that I'm running. So you notice it says 6.2 in my case, because I'm running that latest 6.2.8 release. And they don't create a different doc set for each minor point release, but they do create a different one for each middle point release, the 6.2, and there's a 6.1, and there's a 6.0. So anyway, there's the logs, and in all of them, you can go to the FusionReactor user guide. So these are all different docs. These are not chapters. These are different manuals. A lot of people don't know that there's this much documentation. So read the introduction, read the user guide, learn about JDBC monitoring, user experience monitoring, troubleshooting, protection and monitoring, scripting. Anyway, so under FusionReactor user guide, go to logging. So you don't see it here because my resolution is kind of low. On a higher resolution, you'd have seen it already. But there's logging. And I like to just click this little triangle to expand it in here. I could have just clicked on it here and it would open the page on the right, and then there'd be a table of contents to get to it in there. But I like using this on the left. So in the later versions of the docs, when you get to logging, there'll be log files available in FusionReactor. If you're on an older version, when you come into here, you won't see that. It'll stop here. And if you click here, that was at the bottom of this page. So the overview of FusionReactor logs, it used to be that the list of logs was at the bottom of this page, but it's been moved out to log files available. So it's just easier and quicker to find, because for most people, that's what they wanted to get to. And look at this, boom, there's the log files available. There they are, each of the logs that were in those folders. And for most of them, it's just the name of the log, like the request log, the resource log. For some of them, there's different memory spaces. So there's a memory permgen, memory metaspace, memory old gen, memory survivor space. And then for GCs, depending on your JVM and your garbage collection algorithm, it might be GC mark sweep and GC scavenge. So anyway, that's all discussed in the help. But the point is there's only one help file for all the GC logs, only one help file for all the memory logs, because they all have the same format. They just have different data depending on the type of memory or the type of GC. But back to these, I'd like to show you, for instance, the resource log, because this is my favorite. I think everybody should learn how to use the resource log, and especially in the post-crash troubleshooting webinar, I showed you how you would go to this log to say, well, what was going on, as would have been in those metrics graphs, what was going on in the moments prior to the crash. And I showed this already in passing, but here's how you can see that for every log, it tells you a brief name, It tells you a description. It has a relative number, so if you want to just kind of count across the logs interface and figure out what column it is, you can do that. Also, if you import it into a spreadsheet, which I'll show in a moment, you can see the heading that will automatically be applied. Yep, that's cool. And then finally, in the case of the resource log, they put these landmarks in there to guide you. So the memory percentage is right after the mem fixed separator. So you just look for the word mem. The next column is the used memory percentage. Boom, that's your percentage of heap in use. CPU, the next column is your instances CPU used. Boom. Okay, so yeah, the log help is great. So there you go. And we've seen that, and we've seen that. All right. So now let's talk about importing them. I don't know, we only got about 12 minutes left, but don't worry, this is so easy to do. It doesn't take us much more time than this to get this done. So we can either import a file, or we can copy paste text into your spreadsheet. And again, this applies to Excel, OpenOffice Calc, Google Sheets, whatever you use. Pretty much always the same. LibreOffice, if you're in places where they call OpenOffice LibreOffice, that's what we're talking about. So I'm going to show you how to do it in Excel, but you can easily translate this to other spreadsheets. Almost all of the functionality is just almost exactly the same. They might just use slightly different looking buttons or different names perhaps. So anyway, so as far as importing a file, which means we've got a file, we want to pull it in. So let me set up to do that. So back here I had my file system here. I want to import one of, let's say, my resource log into Excel. Well, you might recall this was a zip, and I'm using Windows Explorer's ability to look at this file within the zip. I wouldn't be able to tell Excel to find that. But what I can do is I can either copy this out to the clipboard, or perhaps some people know this and might find it easier. I can go up to the zip in question, and I can right-click. Well, actually, that's not the same one. Sorry, I hit the up arrow key by mistake. Let me hit the back button. So it was the temp folder. Oh, actually, I think I have more than one Windows Explorer open. That's what's confusing me. I'll tell you what, I'm not, in the interest of time, I'm not going to try to find that exact log. But the point is, if I have a zip, yeah, so here's a zip. If I want to have, say, Excel be able to point to a file in that zip, what I can do is just right-click on the zip and extract it. Usually one of the first things you'll see in Windows by default, or if you use 7-zip or Winzip or anything like that, you'll see an option to extract it. So when I extract that, it's going to create it by default in the same folder with the same name. So there's now going to be a zip of that name, and there's going to be a folder of that name. And by default, it's going to open it up in a moment, and I'll be now seeing that folder and the files in that folder. You know what? I'm sorry. I just realized no, that's right. Okay. Sorry. I've got multiple monitors set up, and anyway, there you go. So this is what we wanted to see. So there's the zip now extracted. If I go up a level, my point was there's now both a zip and a folder of that name. It's in date modified order, so the zip's down at the bottom. But if I sorted it by name, you'd see that there were two things with this name. One's a zip file, one's a folder. But the point is, I can now come into that folder, and I could tell, say, Excel to open this up. Now, I could go to Excel and point to this and all that stuff, but I can also, just as a little trick, a lot of people don't know, I can come up here and click to the right of this, just to the right of this. I can click on it, and now I can copy that path. So now I've got the path to that folder. So I can now go to Excel, which, just a second, I have it open. Okay, sorry about that. So there's Excel open, and I'm going to create a new sheet. So new sheet, or when you first open it up, it defaults to opening. It shows you this by default, and you just click on it to open a new sheet. And put the cursor in the top left corner. It's there by default. I think my mouse just moved and it changed it. But with the cursor in the top left corner, sorry, we'll come back to that in a moment. That's for importing it, pasting it. But for importing it, you could say File, Open, and browse to that location. And again, I've copied the location to my clipboard, so I'm just going to paste that in, and now I'm in that folder. Remember, I'm not in the zip, I'm in that folder that I extracted, and now I could point to the log. And by default, it doesn't show log files, so I just changed this to all files. Right there at the top, all files. And there's my logs, and if I go to my resource log, watch what happens. I'm going to tell it to open this log, and Excel is going to say, oh, that's interesting. That's not a spreadsheet. What do you want me to do with this? And it's detected that it's a log file. It's some sort of a file that it doesn't know. And it would try to pull it in as fixed width, but we want to say it's delimited, and then click the next button and choose as the delimiter the space character. Now I'm going to undo it to show you that if you forgot even, you can just look here and see that there's no commas separating these, there's no tabs separating it, it's a space. So you say I want it to be space delimited, and as soon as you do that, Excel goes, oh, okay, so these are different columns, yes. And that's it, that's all we got to do. We can do more, but we can just say finish, and boom. Now we're seeing that log in the spreadsheet, a nice tabular columnar display, which is really helpful. And there's a lot we could do here. One thing, for instance, is that you could double click on this and it just makes it as wide as it needs to be, and now you can see the whole date. And the time, it's not formatted as a time, but you could right click on this and go to format cell and say that it's a time. Now I know I'm going through this quick because we're running out of time. You can come back and watch the recording later, but I right click, chose format, time, it defaults to the right kind that I want, and boom, now it's got the time in it. All right, so that's that. And for some people, that's enough. Just to be able to see this in a columnar format is great. But you can do so much more. Once you're in here, you can sort things. So we know that this is the CPU column, the use of CPU by ColdFusion, and the total system CPU. Let's say I had a problem where I thought my CPU on the system was high, and I wanted to see when was that. Well, one thing I can do is click on this column and choose, in more modern versions of Excel, you go to Data, and then Sort. And it says, well, I need you to expand the selection, not of what's going to be used to do the sort, but you want all the data to be sorted. Yes, you do. You don't just want the column sorted. So you just let it be, yes, expand the selection and sort it. And it asks you how you want to sort it. And for some reason, it's not smart enough to recognize that I had that column selected. So again, it was column N. So I'll come down here to column N as in Nancy. There it is. N is what I wanted to sort by. And I'll sort it by largest to smallest. And boom. Now this list is in descending order of CPU time. Again, that's not necessarily important for you, but I just want you to see that's one of the benefits of having the spreadsheet pulled in, is you can easily sort things. And you might go, that's kind of interesting, but you know, so what about that? Well, let's do something else. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that when I do the next thing, which is I want to show you how to copy paste things in. So there's the way to do it, and the file open. And of course I could have also right clicked on the file and chosen Excel if I had that set up, or if I wanted to set that up I could right click now and say Excel. But that was that. Now as far as copy paste is, let's just say I go to a place where I have my files like here, and this is whether I've extracted it as a zip or not. Let's say I'm looking at my request log. I want to show you something different. Oh, this one doesn't have any requests. Well, I'll just use the real-time. I would like to show you the request log. On it. Sorry, I've got a little problem where I cannot see, when I do an Alt-Tab, I can't see things opening for me. That's a real weird situation that just happened before the webinar started. So I think this should be it. No, this will be it. All right, I'm going to punt and just go back to the browser and download my current hours logs. Sorry about that. So back to my logging archive, current hours logs. And I know we're right at the top of the hour. I apologize. Got a little excited about some things earlier and elaborated on them that left me running out of time. But I didn't expect to do too much more, so I mean, we might be 5 minutes over. If you guys can hang out and wait 5 minutes over, I don't think we'll need more than 5 minutes to wrap up. All right, so I'm in, again, any one of these archives that I've downloaded, and I want to find my request log. Okay, here's the important point. So I'm going to open my request log, whatever you use, Notepad, WordPad, EditPad, Notepad++, Sublime, Eclipse, Dreamweaver, and in my case, Universal Viewer, whatever you use to open them. The point is, here's my log, and let's say I don't want to extract it from the zip and put it in a file and point to the file. I can just copy all this to the clipboard. And this is what I usually do, which is why I don't do the file system approach, and that was a little bit clunky. Sorry about that. But I usually just copy it to the clipboard, and now I'm going to go back to my Excel, which again I can't see easily right now. I don't know what happened to that. It's literally just minutes before the webinar. All right, so I'm going to create a new sheet, file, new, blank worksheet, blank workbook. Or I could have said new sheet down here, either way, whatever you prefer. But the point is, here I am ready to go into column A1, and I'm just going to paste what I have in the clipboard. This is very important. Check this out. I've copied to the clipboard one of the logs, and I've pasted it into Excel or OpenOffice Calc or Google Sheets. Now, this doesn't look impressive. This is just the same old junk. This is one line. If you know how to hit F2 to see what's in the cell, there, everything in the cell, it's not broken it up. What do you got to do? Well, I've got to come up to data, and say text to columns, text to columns. And it's like the import wizard. It goes, oh, well, I see it's kind of something that I could probably figure out if you tell me how to figure it out. And you go to delimited and next and say space. And that's all I really have to do. And bam, it's done. So there you go. Same sort of thing. Now, what I wanted to show you here was you can get into more compelling things with spreadsheets too. So for instance, let's say I wanted to find, we didn't go into this request log in great detail, but there's columns that track all kinds of different things, and I'm trying to find something like status codes. This is the column that tracks the status code for each request. And let's say I wanted to find out how many, what kind of status codes were there. Well, there's a filter feature. So having selected this column, I can go to not sort, but filter. So under data, filter, and all it does is put this little tiny thing up here. But when I click on it, it now shows me all the values that are in that column. So if I wanted to see what requests had a 503, I could just turn off the 200s and the 302s, and I'm just left with those that are 503. That's filtering. Isn't that cool? All right. Now, one other thing I'll note is that be aware that FusionReactor does track the requests when they start and they end. So some columns that you look for will be on the line whether it's completing or executing, completed or executing. So just be aware of that. Pay attention to that. But anyway, that's that. And then to undo it, I could just do undo Control Z, and I'm right back to where I was. So again, sorting, filtering, pretty cool stuff. If I wanted to, what gets even more interesting is, let's say I go back to, sorry, I just can't, not being able to Alt-Tab is crippling to me because I'm a keyboard guy. Here's my resource log. Yeah. No, I want to stay in the request log. It's just so difficult when I can't see everything. Okay, back to this request log. Yeah, so here's what I wanted to show you. So we saw that we could filter on things, but an even cooler thing is, let's say I wanted to get a breakdown of how many requests. Notice this is what's called the request method. There's a get, and there's a post, you may know, and there's a head, and there's others, all kinds of different ones, puts, and things like that. Let's say you wanted to get a breakdown of how many were there of each type. Well, I can click on the column and go to data, sorry, insert, go to insert. This is a little bit quirky and different, so just take my word for it, just watch the recording later. So you pick your column, go to insert, and you want to make a chart. Now, you can pick among the different kinds of charts, but if I pick recommended chart, it usually does a pretty good job. And check this out, it's presumed, based on the columns in that, the values in that column, it says, let me show you a clustered column report with a count of the types of requests. So check this out. Up pops the graph saying I had 2,000 gets and 136 heads. And here's a chart showing you that. Isn't that cool? And it just did that automatically. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to do that, and by the way, to get rid of that, you just hit the delete key. Undo doesn't do it, but you hit the delete key and then undo that, and you should get back to it. Oh, goodness, what is going on with my keyboard shortcuts? Delete that. I guess I'm going to go back to the sheet. I don't know why that happened. It didn't happen in all my demos before. But anyway, here I'm back to the sheet where I have all the data. But I wanted to say, you might have thought of doing the same thing about this over here under this column for the status code. You might think, hey, could I see a chart of the status codes? And you'd try it, and you'd click on this T, and you'd go to Insert, Recommended Charts, and you'd think it would pop up the same sort of thing, but it doesn't. And you go, that's weird. Well, I noticed it was a clustered column. I'll do that, and I pick clustered column, right there, clustered column. And you look at the graph and you go, wait a minute, that's not what I expected. That's not the same thing at all. Well, this is a little quirk I've noticed, so I'm going to delete this. I've noticed that you have to change the format to string before it'll do that. Since this is numbers, it thinks you want to do a different kind of analysis. So if we just change this to format, and change it to text, format text. Just by doing that, it doesn't change the look. It left justified it, but it doesn't look different in any other way. But now when I do insert recommended chart, it does offer the clustered column chart, and it does show me a breakdown by status code, which is nice. All right, so again, I don't want to get too far into this. I did want to show a few key things because many people don't ever take advantage of this. One last thing I do want to show you is, let me get back, and I'm sorry we've gone long, but let me get back to the logs display. And this is really cool too if you're going to be using the spreadsheet to look at things. If I come in and grab another log, I'll just pick, the memory metaspace log. We haven't talked about it, but I'll just copy it. I'll open it up and I'll copy it to the clipboard. The point I want to demonstrate for you, which is a really cool point, is check it out. I'm going to copy to the clipboard. Control A is what I do, Control C. But check this out. I'm going to come back in here, and whether I say new workbook or new sheet, it doesn't matter whether it's a new workbook or a new sheet. But check this out. I'm going to a blank thing, and I'm going to paste it in. And notice I didn't have to tell it to space separate it. So as long as I have Excel open, it now understands that anything I paste in here, it should presume it's space separated. Yeah, that makes it really nice. So you can really crank on looking at these logs with a spreadsheet, and I've found that worked in OpenOffice Calc as well. So I hope that's helpful to some of you who want to do this kind of analysis. So let's move back quickly to what we were covering. All right, so that's that, and that. And then some of those things I showed you. And I'll just say that I don't have time to show you, but a couple things. One is, you might say, well, gosh, I know that the log has these columns that tell me what the headers are, but aren't there nice headers, like to say that the CPU column has CPU, or that the request log has the status code? Well, there used to be header files, and years ago, for some reason, they were no longer provided. But a gentleman named JC created a GitHub, a Git project on GitHub, and he has started to create header files for each log. And he kind of ran out of gas a couple years ago. I've done some pull requests to offer him some new ones, and he hasn't responded yet. So if he doesn't respond in a couple days, I'll just go ahead and create my own project, and I'll put them all up there because it is really great to be able to have those. But in the interest of time, I'm going to say, if you understand what I'm talking about, great. If you don't, let it go. Let's move on. So we've seen that we can do sorting and filtering. We have unique values. And I didn't show you, but I wish I had time, but one of those charts actually created a pivot table, and pivot tables are amazing. And just do insert pivot table, and you'll see how it works. And I would just say, just Google pivot tables, especially on YouTube. Go to YouTube and just search for pivot tables, and you'll find several wonderful introductions, a few minutes, several minutes, an hour for your taste. You'll find plenty of people talking about how to do them. Now I mentioned that I wasn't going to have time. I knew this. So this free Microsoft LogParser, it's a free tool for querying and reporting against logs. And the point is it's a command line tool, and you use SQL to do the command line analysis of the log files. You need header files, and so that project is very important. And since they were no longer provided, I kind of stopped using it, plus being able to download the zips and open them in Excel, which is making life a whole lot easier. But for those who want to get into it, there are user interface tools. A nice one's called LogParser Lizard that makes it easy to create and store and reuse and rerun the SQL statements that you build for looking at a particular type of log. And I'll just say that if you're interested in that, I had created some years ago a LogParser microsite on my carehart.org where I talk about the tool. I talk about where to learn more. I talk about tools that are related to using it, books and resources. And I even have a subsection of how to use LogParser with FusionReactor. Now this goes back several years and again was more related to FusionReactor 4 and earlier, and things have changed in 5 and above, so some of those headers don't work anymore. They're not there, and then some of these LogParser scripts don't work with some of the current logs. So I'm just going to leave you to look into that if you're interested. There's a wealth of information. I'll leave you to explore that if you're interested. And then I mentioned there were other tools, and so maybe you don't really need a spreadsheet, maybe you don't have a spreadsheet, but you just want to see the logs in a columnar display. They're not as powerful as those other tools, but they're useful, and some of them had filtering features and stuff like that. So I'll just tell you, I've got a whole category of log viewing tools. If you go to cf411.com, that's a site of mine, cf411.com/log viewers, you'll be taken right to the category about 20 different log viewers. They're surprisingly popular, and there's many different ones. And I wish I had time, but I'm going to skip the demo. But check out, I like CSV File View. It's a free, and it's fast to download, fast to install, and it's from a company called Nearsoft. Some of you may know they do great tools. But the point is, it's a very quick, easy way, once you install it, to just, again, point to a log file, and boom, it shows it in columnar display, which is really nice. And then finally, FusionAnalytics. So I said this is a sister product of FusionReactor. Here's the deal. It pulls FusionReactor's logs into itself, and it massages the data and pushes it into a database that it then manages. So this is all local on your own machine. It could be a different machine than where your app server lives. And the database, of course, can be anywhere you want. It could be any database you want. But I think by default right now they only support SQL Server. But you can use the free SQL Server Express, which can store up to 10 gigs. Or if you have a license for it, you can get larger still. But 10 gigs is plenty for a lot of people. The point is, FusionReactor pulls the logs in every hour. It would automatically pull the logs in and aggregate things and roll them up. And then most importantly, check this out, it provides an alternative interface to FusionReactor, and it's still more powerful because it's got lots more analyses that it can do, like show me requests that had the most queries. Right? FusionReactor doesn't have anything that says, show me the request that has the most queries. And let me just explain quickly. You might say, well, why is that in another tool? Well, FusionReactor, remember, is running within your environment. It's running in your JVM. So if they build up too much power in that tool and it does too much analysis, for instance, that is going to make FusionReactor be heavyweight. They don't want FusionReactor to be heavyweight. They want it to be light and fast and hardly noticeable. So really, they could do a lot more, but they choose not to because they don't want to make it too big and heavy. So instead, FusionAnalytics has these tremendous alternative things like just all kinds of things. I'll leave you to look into it. In fact, I just want to say, if you want to look at it, go to fusion-analytics.com, and there's even a demo. I want you especially to notice you could go try it today yourself for free. As soon as you go to the demo and you log in, boom, you're looking at FusionAnalytics, and you could read the online help and watch videos, and eventually we'll do a webinar, because it is definitely worthy of its own webinar. But in the interest of time, I knew I wouldn't have time to demo it. All right, so wrapping up, you can see that there's a lot of ways to use the logs. Easy access within the user interface of the file system. Easy to understand with the online help. Easy to view in a spreadsheet with log view tools. And easy to analyze with spreadsheet, LogParser, and FusionAnalytics tools. And there's much more I could have covered, but in the interest of time, I had to just get through these basics. I want you to be able to take this ball and run with it. And it's a great way to do analysis of your processing in your environment, especially doing post-crash troubleshooting or for trend analysis. Really tremendous value in the tool. So I hope you got a lot of value out of that. Sorry we ran several minutes late. There will be some upcoming webinars we've already got scheduled in the end of June here. Troubleshooting memory problems with FusionReactor. So again, I'll tie together a lot of things I've talked about in some other webinars, but focus solely on troubleshooting memory problems with both the interface, with the logs, and also with your app server's logs and other tools that might be useful for troubleshooting memory problems, but especially focusing on how to use FusionReactor. And then we'll, at some point, we'll do a part 2 of the most recent webinar, or the recent webinar that was called Troubleshooting Identifying Issues. And again, this is more on generic topics, but the memory one will be a very specific one. And you can always register about these and view recordings at FusionReactor.com/webinar, or just Google FusionReactor webinar and you'll find it. Okay, so that was a whirlwind tour, So if you have any follow-up questions, I'm going to look in a moment at what questions. There weren't any earlier when I looked, but you can find out all kinds of information at the FusionReactor website, downloads, docs, videos, tech notes, forums, and more. We have a Google group. It's a wonderful group, lightweight, not a lot of questions and answers, high signal ratio, there's virtually no noise, if you understand what I mean by that. And then you can also send questions about sales-related things to sales@FusionReactor.com, and you can send things about support and a feature that doesn't work or how do you use something. They're really good, so you can send an email to support@Fusion-Reactor.com, or you can call with questions about sales at this phone number in the US. And you can get assistance with using FusionReactor and also troubleshooting things for your application server environment via a sister site called cfconsultant.com. And sometimes I may be the consultant that will be assigned, because again, I don't work for them, but I work with them, and I do this troubleshooting on my own, and I do some with them as well. So we'd welcome your feedback on these webinars and the other ones we've done. If you have any ones you'd like to see, send an email or call the sales folks to let them know. All right, so now let me turn to see if there were any questions I didn't get to. What is the green cloud? Okay, so just real quick, it's funny, that's the only question. I guess that's a good thing if that's the only question that's come up so far. Somebody said, what's the green cloud? Oh, good, and so lots of thank yous, I appreciate that. But back to the FusionReactor interface on this monitor. Just so annoying that I can't see where my alt tabs are taking me. I'm just guessing, and that's not working well. So let's get this way. Never had that happen. Demo gods. Always something happens when you're doing demos that never happens otherwise. All right, so somebody had asked, if you look up in the top right corner of my screen, something he did never notice on his FusionReactor is this little green cloud icon. Now, I believe about 2 months ago, one of the webinars by David Tattersall, who's the CEO of Integral, was on FusionReactor Cloud. So go watch that webinar about FusionReactor Cloud, because I don't have time to get into it now, but I'll just say briefly that the cloud version of FusionReactor is something you pay just a little bit extra for, and what you get is everything is the same as what you already currently have, but in addition, there's a connection made from your server up to a cloud implementation of FusionReactor. So let me be clear, this is not about your applications and your servers being in the cloud. It's not. You can be on a standalone server, a VM, your local desktop, developer machine, whatever you want. This is about, there's a FusionReactor service in the cloud, and when you buy the cloud version, your data will be sent up to your version of that cloud, and there'll be a web interface on the web-based interface that accesses that data in the cloud, and it provides a great majority of what FusionReactor has, but it's accessible through the cloud. Now, one of the real benefits of that is that the interface there does not lose its data when you restart, because remember, the data now is no longer being viewed from within FusionReactor, which is within your JVM. When you go to the cloud interface, you're looking at the data that's stored in the cloud for you, and they have a database they manage. It's a NoSQL database. They take care of it. You don't pay extra for the size. I mean, it's a great deal. Definitely check out FusionReactor Cloud. But you're looking at an interface that looks at that cloud data for you and your server or servers, and it supports clustered instances and all that stuff. But the point is, you could look at the day before crash because it's in a database. So it is a different thing than everything we've talked about. And the logs are for those who don't have that, or maybe want to do something quickly, or maybe there's levels of detail that are in the logs that are not in the cloud version, or maybe not even in the FusionReactor interface. Okay, So that's FusionReactor Cloud. Definitely check it out. Again, there's a webinar about it. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you. Yep, a FusionAnalytics one would be great. Yep. All right. Well, again, everybody's just saying thank yous. No other questions. So I'll say, unless you're waiting to get one in, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. And if you slip one in after I stop the recording, I'll answer you off the recording. But otherwise, thanks everybody for coming, and we'll see you at the end of June for the memory troubleshooting one. Thanks everybody for all your kind regards.